welcome back to Turning Points, where we look at some key biblical events and how they still affect us today. Last time we looked at the tabernacle, that portable structure that served as God's dwelling place among the Jewish people. As elaborate as the plans for that structure were, it was still a rather humble home for the God who made heaven and earth. But it was a reminder to us that even though our sin separates us from God, He has always longed for, even fought for, an intimate relationship with people. The Ark of the Covenant and the room it sat in, the Holy of Holies, served as the throne room for God among the Jews. But He was never limited to that space. In fact, He tells Isaiah the prophet this, "Heaven is my throne, and earth is my footstool. Where is the house that you would build for me? Where will my resting place be? Has not my hand made all these things?" God's greatest desire was not that we build a building for Him where we could visit Him on occasion, but He wanted to live within us. He wanted us to see ourselves as His temple where He lives and rules. So Israel escaped Egypt under God's protective power. They crossed through the Red Sea. He brought them to Mount Sinai and gave them the law. In fact, it was there that they camped for about a year, preparing themselves and building this tabernacle. But after a year, they began this journey across the desert to the land of Canaan. It was to Canaan that God brought Abraham centuries earlier, and He made him this promise. He said, "Look around from where you are, to the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever." That was when Abraham's family could be counted on two hands. Now they numbered in the tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands, a true nation in the making. Canaan was just 200 miles across the desert, a journey that would take a couple of months, 3 or 4 at the outset. You can imagine the anticipation the Jewish people felt about entering the land that was promised to their forefathers. But little did they realize that this 200-mile journey would take them decades, and that none of those adults that crossed through the Red Sea would ever see the land that was promised to them. Why would God bring Israel out of Egypt just to leave them stranded out here in the desert? Well, it was simply because they had not yet learned to trust God's leadership. And that lack of faith led them to constantly complain. They complained about not having bread, and then they complained about not having meat. They complained about Moses' leadership and their hardships. And it didn't matter whether God responded to those complaints with punishment or with blessings, they still complained. It frustrated Moses, it disappointed God, but ultimately it led God to delay Israel's return to the land of Canaan in order to teach them that He is a God who can be and should be trusted. Nowhere was that lack of faith more clearly seen than when God invited Israel to take the land of Canaan the first time. The people selected one person from each tribe to go in and explore the land and come and report back. So 12 men went into the land for 40 days undercover. They learned about the people, about the fortifications, about their crops. And they came back to report that the land was more fertile and glorious than they had ever expected. In fact, they brought back huge clusters of grapes just to show how fertile the land was. And after living a year in the desert of Sinai, reports of a fertile homeland had to be enticing. But they had another report, a more fearful one. They said the cities are well fortified and that the fighting men in Canaan were larger than any of the Jewish men. They said, "We look like grasshoppers compared to them." So they made 2 recommendations. First, they recommended that they choose a new leader. Basically, that they mutiny against Moses' leadership. And secondly, they said that they should turn around, go back to Egypt, and turn themselves in. After escaping Egypt, after watching the Egyptian army die in the flooded Red Sea, after spending a year out in this desert, now they were ready to go back to Egypt and become slaves again. But there were two other voices from explorers who had a different view of the matter. Joshua and Caleb saw the same sights the other 10 explorers saw, but they came back with this report. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and don't be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. But the voice of the other 10 explorers, along with a fearful nation, drowned out the voices of Joshua and Caleb. And the people decided that they were not yet ready to enter the land promised to them. That lack of faith was a final straw for God. In his righteous anger, he threatened to wipe out the whole nation and just start over with Moses. But Moses interceded for the people, and God relented. But he did say he was still going to start over. He told the nation that all those adults who doubted that God could give them the land that he promised them, all of them would die wandering in the desert for the next 40 years. And then God would bring back this next generation, their children, to this moment of decision. Joshua and Caleb, who faithfully knew God could bring them into the promised land, they survived the 40 years, as did Moses, who continued to lead the people. But all the other adults, all those who witnessed God's destructive power in Egypt, all those who crossed over the Red Sea to rescue, all who stood at the foot of Mount Sinai and saw God's presence descend to the top of that mountain, all of them died wandering in the desert over the next 40 years, just 100 miles away from the land that had been promised them. And when this new generation, after 40 years of wandering, returned to this moment of decision, they sent in spies as well, who saw the same glories and the same threats, but they reported this news: the Lord has surely given the whole land into our hands. All the people are melting in fear because of us. Moses had recently died, and God had replaced him with Joshua, one of those earlier spies who had trusted God's leadership. That's when God told Joshua to be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid or discouraged, because the Lord your God will go with you wherever you go. So Joshua brought the nation to the border of the land of Canaan, marked by the Jordan River. And there this new generation, who had only heard the stories of what it was like to cross the Red Sea, this generation saw God part the waters of the Jordan River, and they crossed over on dry ground into their new homeland. The story of this journey home is an important part of the history of the Jewish people, but it's also the story of our own journeys, because everybody's journey has 4 different stories in it. There are stories of enslavement, there are stories of rescue, there are stories of wandering, and there are stories of homecoming. Everybody knows what it's like to be trapped by someone or something that takes control of our lives and won't let go. And God's message to all of us, his good news, is that he has come to rescue from the things that seek to exert their power over us and bring us back into a relationship with him. But even after God has rescued us, we still spend our life on this wandering journey. Sometimes we respond with great faith. Sometimes we respond with fear and doubt. But if we continue the journey of faith, and if we quiet the voices of fear and doubt, we will ultimately reach the borders of our homeland, and we will cross over into it. It would be nice if our path to fulfillment was a straight highway, just like it would have been nice if Israel could have marched directly from Mount Sinai to the land of Canaan. But life is oftentimes much more like a wandering. Sometimes the path ahead of us is clearly seen, sometimes it disappears from view. But it's not so important that we're able to see the path ahead of us, but that we learn to trust the guide who leads us. And so God tells Joshua to not be afraid, but be strong and courageous because he is with him always. And Jesus tells his disciples, who could hardly have foreseen the struggles ahead in their future, that he was the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one could come to the Father but through him. And so you and I face our unforeseen future. And yet we're able to still sing, to Canaan's land I'm on my way. And we're marching on to Zion. And on Jordan's stormy banks I stand. Always looking past the wanderings to the promised homeland and trusting God to get us there. Join us next time when we'll talk about one of Israel's early kings that served as a model for the great king that he promised them in their future.